So this is just a quick video on a somewhat old news story at this point, the Brazilian elections. For those that don't know, Brazil just had an election where they elected a pretty staunchly conservative candidate by the name of Jair Bolsonaro, being referred to as the Brazilian Donald Trump, or Tropical Trump. And of course, if you read any left-leaning news sources, especially sources like Vox, you'll get the standard treatment that we saw after our own 2016 election. Fake news. These poor conservatives just didn't understand what was going on. They were influenced by outside sources. Yada yada yada. And it's almost like the soft bigotry of low expectations here. It's how could this have happened? And it's the same standard narrative. Oh my God, democracy failed. Blah blah blah. So anyways, there's this article on Vox called Corruption, Fake News, and WhatsApp, How Bolsonaro Won Brazil. And remember, he couldn't have won because people were sick of crime and corruption, danger in the streets. He couldn't have won running on conservative values in a country where the vast majority of the population is Christian, and as a result, socially fairly conservative. And that can't be it. It has to be fake news. It has to be election meddling. People just didn't understand. That was the issue. So let's see what Vox's take is on the Brazilian election. So the article starts out by saying Brazil elected far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro in its presidential runoff on Sunday, breaking a nearly two-decade-old tradition of almost exclusively electing leftist presidents, under whom, by the way, the country went from one of South America's most promising economies to, well, what it is now, basically a recession, a complete collapse of the economy due to several gigantic corruption scandals that rocked the country and brought down several of the country's giant state-run companies. Petrobras was one of those, but that's maybe a topic for another video. One of the article goes on to say, Bolsonaro, a Congress member and ex-military officer, started off his campaign as a fringe candidate from a fringe party, who was mostly known for his streak of racist, misogynistic, and anti-LGBTQ remarks, for his professed fondness for the country's brutal military dictatorship. And this is one thing I found really interesting on just about every source I read on this election. There wasn't I really didn't see much mention of any of his policy ideas, his platform, what he stood for. It was mostly, there were about 4 quotes that were in every single left-leaning article. Something about gays. I think he made some comment about how if his son were gay, he'd rather be dead. Pretty inflammatory stuff. There was a female politician that he said wasn't worth raping. Again, not great, but again, these were from like 20 years ago. At least that specific one was. And I just found it odd that I found the exact same quotes in every article I read. Now, to be fair, we do live in the internet age, and news sources rely on clickability, not necessarily accurate or informative content. So it makes sense that they'd pick the most sensationalist things to say. But it always strikes me as odd whenever I delve into left-leaning sources. I get almost the exact same. It's almost like they're a monolith. It's the exact same narrative. You know, I go on, whenever I'm on YouTube and I see a clip of Jimmy Kimmel pop up, it's basically the exact same topic with the exact same jokes as what you'll see on Colbert that night or on Seth Meyers. It's all the same thing. And I saw that with the election coverage too, which I just thought that was interesting. But I digress. The article goes on to say, but his promise to restore security amid endemic violent crime and to stamp out the country's rampant political corruption won him support among voters looking for a change. Many in Brazil have grown frustrated with the status quo due to a slew of political and economic crises that have gripped the country in recent years. The current center-right president, Michel Temer, is deeply unpopular in the wake of a struggling economy and a massive corruption scandal that has engulfed all levels of government. Temer took over, this is mostly history, but basically the president before him was another leftist president from the Workers' Party, Dilma Rousseff, all the Western sources will call her Rousseff, but I know in Portuguese an R at the beginning of a word is actually pronounced like an H, so it's Dilma Rousseff. But again, not that important. She was impeached anyways, and that's how the current president Michel Temer, or I guess previous now that Bolsonaro was elected, he took over after her. And before her, though, it was another leftist named Lula who was extremely popular and is now serving a 12-year sentence on corruption charges. So the article says by it, while Lula himself is still very popular in Brazil, his handpicked successor, Fernando Haddad, that's the guy that ran against Bolsonaro, was soundly defeated by Bolsonaro. On the eve of the Brazilian elections, I called up Benjamin Jung, maybe Junji, I'm not exactly sure if he's Brazilian or not, so I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But he called this political scientist to get a deeper understanding of voters in Brazil. I think there's a word missing there. Deeper understanding of voters in Brazil. I guess he means why voters in Brazil supported the far-right candidate. We'll just call him Jung. Jung is an anthropology professor at the state... sorry, not a political science professor. He's an anthropology professor at the State University of New York at New Paltz, and a Fulbright Fellow at the Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, who studies working-class and middle-class families in Brazil. So here's their conversation. The Vox journalist asks, are the Brazilian voters you talk to mostly rejecting the leftist Workers' Party, or are they actively choosing Bolsonaro? Well, my observation is that the actual ideological hard-right voters within working-class communities, which is to say people who are voting for Bolsonaro because they love him and they've analyzed his plans and they think they're great, are a small minority. I would say the same about the old-school Workers' Party's supporters, too. They're still there, and I see them marching around with T-shirts that have images of Lula from 4 years ago. The issue is the mass of working-class voters in between those two poles. The question is, why is it that so many of them seem to be open to a guy who's expressed a disregard for democracy and said such foul things? That's the thing I also love reading these articles. And this I think, is a parallel you'll see covering pretty much any election where the left doesn't get its way. It's not their message that was wrong. It's not their campaigning or their politicking. It's not their branding that was not as good as their opponent. Democracy failed. Democracy must have failed. It must be democracy or the system that didn't work. It wasn't their fault. It's never their fault. It's always democracy has failed. And we'll probably hear this in the midterm elections tomorrow, depending on how that turns out. But let's continue. People are definitely talking a lot about security and violence in the neighborhoods, and they're genuinely fed up with what they perceive as a failure of the state to take care of security issues. And that's a real thing. Yeah, that makes sense. I think something like, I don't know the exact number, like 10 or 20 of the most violent cities in the world are in Brazil. There's a lot of crime and violence and poverty. And when times are tough, yeah, people tend to turn to authoritarianism. So it's not a huge surprise that someone like this would win. I wouldn't say it's necessary. I wouldn't chalk it up to fake news or election meddling or anything like that. So he goes, but doesn't Lula still have a lot of popular support? Is what the journalist asks. And Benjamin, we'll call him Ben actually, that's the anthropology professor, he goes, let me give you a quick little anecdote. Right before Lula was found guilty and went to prison last January, the matriarch of a family that I've been following very closely, who is a widow and is 66 years old, she was watching TV. At one moment she said, oh my God, is there any way I can still love this man? Meaning Lula. When he went to prison, she posted something on Facebook saying she was indignada, fed up. She alternates between a deep love for Lula and a kind of hate for him because he seems to have screwed everything up. A guy who did a lot of good and could have done much more, but didn't. So they love Lula the man, but don't love the system around him, the journalist asks. Yes, very strongly. And it's almost like you know what kind of a narrative they're trying to paint with this article. It's, oh, well, these silly conservatives, they couldn't have known what they really wanted. They must have been swayed by fake news, by election meddling, and yada, yada, yada. But they're disproving their own narrative here. They're saying, even if that's true, the exact same thing is going on the left. They're voting for Lula not because they agree with anything he stands for, or they like the Workers' Party, or socialist policies, or anything like that. They just like the guy. They're just as ignorant as the conservatives they're trying to lambaste here, or are going to later on in the article, they're defeating their own narrative here. But let's keep going. He says, yes, very strongly. And this is what political scientists are scratching their heads about, and anthropologists maybe not quite so much. Political scientists say, wait, that's very irrational. If they love Lula so much, why don't they just vote for the other guy whom Lula anointed, Fernando Haddad? But that's not happening. And the journalist asks, can you explain exactly what disconnect is happening? He goes, this woman I mentioned is typical in another respect, which is she has never really taken politics seriously. So she came to love Lula. She would definitely be voting for him if he were on the ballot, but it wasn't for what he represented. It was just the kind of man he presented himself to be. So again, this is exactly contrary to the narrative they're trying to paint. And if anything, you know with Fox, they want to paint a picture of these conservatives. They're influenced by fake news. They didn't know what's going on, but we're seeing so far your expert is describing this phenomenon on the left only. They've had, as they said, 12 years of leftist government, leftist presidents, Lula and Dilma Rousseff, and it seems like they weren't voting for them at all because of anything they stood for. They just liked them as people, which is fine. But this goes completely opposite of the narrative they're trying to paint. So he goes, she's in her mid-60s. She has 5 grown children who are all in their 30s and 40s, most of whom have children of their own. They all live in the same building in different households, and what is creating stress in the family is playing out in the family's WhatsApp group, is what he means to say, which is the way it's happening across Brazil. So WhatsApp, for those that don't know, is a messaging app. It's basically texting over an app, pretty much. It's owned by Facebook now. It's very, very common in other countries. I think it's pretty common in the U.S. as well, but I've noticed it's definitely popular in Europe and among Brazilians as well. I've known quite a few Brazilian friends that I, even to this day, communicate with over WhatsApp. So anyways, this family's WhatsApp group was set up for social events and to send memes, but the oldest son is a Bolsonaro supporter. He's that rare and somewhat uncommon variety of a very ideological, serious supporter. He posts stuff about Bolsonaro in the family's WhatsApp group. There's a grandson who's 18 years old in his first year of college, and he responds with, "What are you talking about? That doesn't make sense." Well, if they're afraid of people sharing fake news over WhatsApp groups, it sounds like it's not working if people are questioning it, even in their anecdote here. So the journalist goes, you mentioned fake news. It seemed, and this is where we get into the more interesting part of the article. You mentioned fake news. It seemed that's played a huge role in the election. How have you seen that play out? To which the answer is Facebook and WhatsApp are the fake news issue. A couple of weeks ago, this matriarch, who I've been talking about, we bumped into each other, and I'm always bugging them with questions about the election. This was before the first round elections. She showed me a picture of a clip that was circulating of some woman in this public space that took off her shirt and bared her breasts. She showed this to me and said, "I don't want this kind of society. Is this what we want?" And I said, "Wait a minute, who is this person?" And she says, "This is what we would get if we support the Workers' Party, or at least this is what will be fixed if Bolsonaro gets elected." And it was just some ridiculous fake news thing. Who knows if it was actually the Bolsonaro people who put it into circulation, but it was circulated by Bolsonaro's supporters. Look, I agree that's kind of a silly leap to make, but then again...
What's your name?
My name's Alex.
And yours?
My name is Devlin.
And why are you ladies at the slut walk tonight?
Why are we here? I'm here to support women. Because we're hoes.
You're hoes?
Yeah, because
You're hoes. And so what is a whore?
it's a woman.
Anyways, the journalist goes on to say, you mentioned WhatsApp a lot as something used by the family to communicate, but also to get information about the election. How important is it in influencing the vote? And the anthropologist goes, I don't even fully appreciate just how pervasive WhatsApp groups are. I think that every family in Brazil has a WhatsApp group that has more than one cell phone user in it. And I believe that that cuts across class in a big way. The way that it might be a little different is that working class families tend to be bigger than elite families. Every kind of like religious community, every evangelical church, every individual kind of Catholic church has a WhatsApp group. Uber drivers in different neighborhoods and cities have WhatsApp groups. Everybody has a WhatsApp group. I'm teaching two classes, yada yada. They both have WhatsApp groups. And secondarily, Facebook. Facebook is also hugely important, but my intuitive sense is that WhatsApp is where the real frictions and kind of circulation of content is happening, and possibly where opinion formation, the actual congealing of voter sensibility, is concentrated. And this is the thing that scared me the most about this article and several others that I read on Vox. Now, and I don't use WhatsApp that much. In fact, I mostly use it to keep in touch with friends in other countries and things like that. But WhatsApp is, like I said, a messaging app. It's basically texting. And I kept looking at these articles where they were concerned about fake news being spread over WhatsApp. And I kept asking myself, well, I don't agree with it, but I can at least understand that argument with Facebook where you can share it out in public and anyone can see it. Even if I disagree with that kind of censorship, you could at least make that an argument. But it sounds like you want to crack down on people's private conversation. Is there something I'm missing? Is there some functionality, some new functionality on WhatsApp that I haven't seen that's more? No, it's not. They legitimately are okay with regulating private conversations. That's the next step of all this, and that is absolutely insane. So this was kind of a rambly video, kind of all over the place. I didn't really sit down and plan this one very much. I just wanted to fire off a video real quick. But I think it's a little crazy. I think it's funny, the coverage we see from left-leaning sources every time there's an election that doesn't go their way. I think it's very funny to read that. I think it's funny how they contradict their own narrative. And I think it's scary that they, at the end of the day, would love to censor and crack down private conversations between people over text. But hopefully that won't be the case. And no matter what side you're on, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum or outside of it, hopefully you go out and vote. This video will probably be out by the time the election's over, so I guess hopefully you have already voted. And hopefully I will put out a video covering the results as well. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe below. Thanks so much for taking a listen. Have a nice day.